The last signature. I was standing in a room full of people who loved my father, and I was the only one who knew he had just destroyed me. The attorney's voice kept going, dry, practiced, like he'd read 1,000 wills before mine and would read 1,000 after. But I'd stopped hearing the actual words about 40 seconds after he said my brother's name. My brother Kyle. 26 years old, hadn't spoken to our father in 3 years before the diagnosis, showed up at Christmas with a girlfriend none of us had ever met, and somehow, he was now the sole heir to everything. The house on Clearwater Drive, the auto parts distribution company that I had, with my own two hands, grown from a struggling regional supplier into a 7-state operation. The investment portfolio, the life insurance payout, all of it. Every last piece of what my father and I had built together, sitting there in Kyle's lap like a gift. He hadn't even had the decency to look surprised about. I looked at my brother across the mahogany table in that attorney's office on 5th and Clement, and his eyes were already wet with what I was supposed to interpret as grief. He was dabbing at them with his shirt collar. He had this expression on his face, this soft, slightly downturned expression. And I realized that he had known. He had known before we walked in here. He had known for a long time. My name was mentioned once. Once, in a paragraph that thanked me for my years of dedicated service to the family business and bequeathed to me my father's watch. A Seiko. Nothing wrong with a Seiko watch. My father wore it every day. But it was $42 on eBay, and it was all I got. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I picked up my purse, pushed back my chair, and I walked out of that office, down the elevator, through the lobby that smelled like floor cleaner and forced air, and out into the October afternoon. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 45 minutes. I didn't turn it on. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there with my hands flat on my thighs and breathed until I was sure I could drive without killing someone. Then I drove home. And I started planning. But I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who my father was, who I was to him, and exactly how thoroughly and deliberately he chose to erase everything I'd given him. My father's name was Gerald Raymond Calloway. Everyone called him Ray. He was born in 1952 in a small town outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, the second son of a mechanic who drank and a mother who made it through by pretending the drinking wasn't happening. He was a charming, restless, brilliant man who could fix any engine you put in front of him and charm any room he walked into. He was also stubborn as a fence post, allergic to admitting he was wrong, and constitutionally incapable of asking for help. Except from me. With me, he'd learned to ask. It had taken years, but he'd learned. He started Callaway Auto Parts Distribution out of a warehouse he rented for $800 a month in 1989, the year I was born. My mother, Diane, was pregnant with me when he signed that lease. She always said he patted her stomach and said, "This one's going to be our lucky charm." She thought it was sweet. She had no idea how literally he meant it. My mother left when I was 11 and Kyle was 4. She didn't leave dramatically. There was no screaming exit, no slammed doors. She just started spending more and more nights at her sister's place in Portland. And one morning, my father sat Kyle and me down at the kitchen table and explained that Mom had decided she needed a different life. Kyle cried immediately, loud and theatrical, the way small children do. I remember sitting very still and thinking, okay, so now what? I was 11. I was already trying to figure out what needed to happen next. That's the difference between me and Kyle that you need to understand from the beginning. When something broke, I figured out how to fix it. Kyle waited for someone else to. By the time I was 14, I was keeping the books for Callaway Auto Parts. Not because my father asked me to, not because he forced me, because I picked up one of his ledgers when he fell asleep on the couch one Saturday afternoon, and I realized the numbers didn't add up. I found 2 billing errors that were costing him several $1,000s a year. I showed him at breakfast the next morning. He stared at the paper for a long time and then looked at me with this expression I would come to know very well over the years. A mixture of pride and something else, something complicated that I never quite had the right word for. Gratitude, maybe. Or dependence. Sometimes I wonder if I mistook one for the other. I graduated high school at 17. I got into Northwestern on a partial scholarship, business administration. I was going to go. I had my acceptance letter, my financial aid package, a roommate assignment, everything. And then, 4 days before I was supposed to leave for Evanston, my father had a small heart attack. Not the big one that would come later. Just a warning shot. He was 51 years old, the business was in the middle of expanding to 3 new states, and his lead operations manager had just quit. I deferred my admission for 1 semester. That semester turned into a year. That year turned into forever. I'm not going to pretend I didn't make a choice. I did. But I need you to understand the context of that choice, and I need you to understand who was making it. I was an 18-year-old girl who had been essentially running her father's household since she was 11, who had been her father's business partner since she was 14, who had been told since she could form memories that she was the responsible one, the capable one, the one who could be counted on. When your entire identity is built around being the person who handles things, it's not really a choice when something needs to be handled. It just feels like who you are. So I stayed. And I ran Callaway Auto Parts distribution while my father recovered, and then I kept running it, and then I started growing it. And year by year, it became something neither of us had imagined when he rented that $800 warehouse. I hired good people. I renegotiated supplier contracts. I brought us into the digital age, kicking and screaming, my father included. I opened distribution channels in 4 new states. I established a commercial fleet division that doubled our revenue in 3 years. By the time I was 32, the year my father got his Parkinson's diagnosis. Callaway Auto Parts was a $12 million operation with 84 employees. My title was Vice President of Operations. My father remained President and CEO nominally. In practice, I ran the company. We both knew it. He would come in 2 or 3 days a week and sit in the big office and drink his coffee and shake hands with people and sign things I put in front of him. Those days mattered to him enormously. I never took them away. What I'm telling you is that I loved my father. I'm saying it plainly because I want you to understand that this story isn't about a woman who sacrificed herself out of obligation or resentment. I genuinely loved him. I loved working with him. I loved the way he'd light up when we closed a big deal, loved the way he'd clap me on the shoulder. He was a shoulder clapper, my dad, never quite comfortable with hugs, and say, "That's my girl." I loved driving him to his Parkinson's appointments and listening to him talk on the way home about the old days, the early days, the ways things used to work. I loved sitting in his kitchen on Sunday mornings making eggs while he read the paper, even though he never actually read it. He just liked having it there. I thought he loved me too. I thought I knew what that meant. Kyle, meanwhile, had become someone I barely recognized. He'd been a sweet kid, genuinely. Funny, a little spacey, the kind of little brother who made you roll your eyes and ruffle his hair. But somewhere in his mid-teens, he developed what I can only describe as a gift for wanting things without being willing to work for them. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters. He worked a series of jobs, bartender, gym trainer, something involving crypto that he refused to explain. And he borrowed money from our father with the relaxed confidence of a man who doesn't really believe debt is real. He and my father had a major falling out when Kyle was 23 over a $10,000 loan that Kyle spent on a truck he totaled 6 months later. They didn't speak for almost a year. Then they sort of reconciled the way people do when they're family and they don't have the energy for permanent ruptures. When my father was diagnosed with Parkinson's at 62, Kyle called from wherever he was living at the time, Denver, I think, and said all the right things. He came home for a weekend, he cried, he hugged Dad, he told me I was doing an amazing job. Then he went back to Denver. For the next 4 years, I managed my father's illness alongside everything else. I drove him to doctor's appointments. I hired and managed his home health aide, a kind Jamaican woman named Bernadette, when the tremors got bad enough that he needed help. I researched Parkinson's medications and dosage adjustments and clinical trials. I managed his finances because his condition eventually made it difficult for him to track numbers reliably. I made sure his house was safe. Handrails, non-slip mats, better lighting. I did these things while also running a $12 million company. And I did them because he was my father, and because they needed to be done, and because I was me. Kyle visited twice a year. Christmas and Father's Day, usually. He was charming when he was there. He was the fun one, the one who'd make Dad laugh, do impressions, pull him out of the gray moods that Parkinson's brings. I understood, in some abstract way, that this had its own value. But I also knew that someone had to be there at 2 a.m. when Dad fell, trying to get to the bathroom, and that someone was me. Someone had to sit with him through the bad medication adjustments that left him shaking and frightened, and that someone was me. Someone had to hold his hand in the neurologist's office and write down everything the doctor said because his handwriting had become illegible, and that someone was me. I told myself it was enough, being that person. I told myself my father saw it. I told myself that the love I felt in those quiet, difficult moments, when he squeezed my hand in the car after an appointment and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Callie," was real and was recognized and would matter. My name is Caroline Renee Calloway. Everyone calls me Callie. I was 33 years old when my father got his diagnosis, and 37 when he died. I never got back to Northwestern. I never married, though I came close once with a man named David, who eventually left because he said I was already married to that company. I never lived anywhere except the 20-minute radius of my father's house. And here's the thing I need you to hold on to as this story continues. I don't think I would trade it. Even knowing what I know now, I don't think I could have made myself walk away from him. That's not a healthy thing to say. I know that. But it's true. What I would trade, what I will never stop being furious about, is the lie. Not that he left more to Kyle. Not even that he left everything to Kyle. What I cannot forgive, what I will go to my own grave carrying, is that he looked me in the eye for the last year of his life, every single week, while I was holding his hand through the worst of it, while I was managing his medications and his business and his dignity. And he said nothing. He let me believe I was seen. He let me believe it mattered. That is what I cannot forgive. And that is what I made him pay for. The first thing I noticed was about 14 months before my father died, though I didn't understand what I was seeing until much later. I had driven him to what I thought was a routine appointment with Dr. Simmons, his neurologist at University Medical. It was a routine appointment. But my father had asked me to drop him off at the front entrance and wait in the car rather than coming in with him. He said he wanted to talk to Dr. Simmons privately. He said, gently and carefully, "I'm still allowed to have private conversations with my own doctor, Callie." I remember laughing and saying of course he was, and I went and sat in the car and listened to a podcast about restaurant management for 45 minutes while he was inside. Looking back, I now know he did not go to see Dr. Simmons that day. His appointment was at 2. At 1:30, I'd noticed a white Honda Civic parked near the entrance. unremarkable in every way, except that I'm the kind of person who notices things like cars, and I thought I recognized it as Kyle's girlfriend's car. Kyle was dating a woman named Serena at the time, had been for about a year, and I'd met her twice at family dinners. She drove a white Honda Civic with a small dent in the rear passenger door. I noted it the way you note something that doesn't quite fit, and then file away because it doesn't seem important. I didn't pursue it. I didn't mention it to my father. When he came back to the car, he seemed tired, but okay. And I drove him home and we talked about a supplier issue I was dealing with, and I forgot about the white Honda. I should have pulled on that thread immediately, but I was running a company and managing his care, and I didn't have the bandwidth for threads that seemed thin. The second thing happened about 8 months before he died. I was at the house, going through his mail, one of my regular Sunday tasks, since he'd given me power of attorney for financial matters, and I managed his bills. And I found an envelope from an attorney's office I didn't recognize. The firm was called Hartley and Associates, with an address on Meridian Boulevard. I knew every business relationship my father had managed them for years. He had a corporate attorney named Phil Rieger at a firm downtown. I did not know Hartley and Associates. The envelope had already been opened. I told myself he'd opened his own mail, which was obviously his right, but the letter inside had been removed. The envelope was there, empty, with the firm's return address clearly visible, but whatever had been in it was gone. I asked my father about it casually while we were having lunch in his kitchen. I said, "Dad, I noticed a letter from an attorney, Hartley, on Meridian. Do you have something going on I should know about?" I kept my voice light, administrative, because I genuinely assumed it was probably something routine. A property matter, an old contract, something that had somehow landed with a different firm. My father looked at me, and just for a moment, just for a fraction of a second, there was something in his face that I can only describe now as guilt. Then it was gone, replaced by the slightly vague expression he'd developed over the past year, the one that sometimes meant his thoughts were moving slowly, and sometimes meant he didn't want to answer. "Oh, that," he said. "Just some old business, nothing you need to worry about." I pushed gently. "Dad, if there's a legal matter, I should probably know about it. That's kind of my job these days." "It's fine, Callie," he said, and there was just a hint of firmness in his voice that told me the door was closed. "It's old business. Nothing to do with the company." I let it go. I hate that I let it go, but I let it go. The third sign was the one that, in retrospect, screams at me the loudest. About 6 months before my father died, Kyle started calling more often. Not just calling my father, Kyle started calling me. Checking in, he said, asking how Dad was doing, asking about the business. He'd never shown much interest in the business. If anything, he'd always been slightly dismissive of it. The kind of dismissiveness that reads as insecurity, but that I'd always interpreted as just general Kyle-ness. Suddenly, he was asking smart questions, specific questions. "How's the fleet division doing? Did we close that contract with the Cincinnati supplier? How are the margins looking on the commercial side?" I thought he was maturing. I thought, with genuine warmth, that maybe the reality of our father's decline was bringing out a more responsible version of Kyle. I answered his questions. I told him the business was in great shape. I told him we'd had our best year ever. I told him I was proud of what we'd built. I told Kyle Calloway, who already knew he was going to inherit everything, exactly how valuable the thing he was inheriting was. I think about that now, and my jaw tightens so hard I can feel it in my teeth. My father died on a Thursday morning in March, 7 months after those calls from Kyle began. He died at home, in his own bed, which is what he'd wanted. Bernadette was there. I was there. Kyle had driven up from Denver the week before when it became clear we were in the final stretch, and he had been present and seemingly grief-stricken. And honestly, I'd been grateful for him those last few days. We'd sat together on the back porch in the evenings, Kyle and I, and talked about Dad the way you do when someone is leaving. The funny stories, the old memories, the small details you're afraid you'll forget. Kyle had cried. I'd held his hand. He knew the whole time what was in that will. He sat there and let me hold his hand, and he knew. My father died at 6:42 in the morning. The light coming through his bedroom window was that thin, pale, early spring light, and I was holding his right hand, and Bernadette was on the other side holding his left, and it was quiet. He went quietly. I'll give him that. I held myself together for 2 weeks. I made the arrangements, I handled the obituary, I managed the service, a genuinely large crowd, because Ray Calloway was a man who people wanted to come out for, and I was glad for that. I stood at the reception afterward and accepted condolences and said thank you and meant it. I went home every night and sat in my apartment and felt the absence of him like a physical thing, like a hole in the center of the room. The will reading was scheduled for 16 days after his death. Standard enough timeline. The appointment was with Phil Rieger, his long-established attorney, the one I knew. I had no idea that Phil Rieger had been superseded. I want to describe the attorney's office to you because the details matter, because I've replayed this room so many times in my head that I need you to see it too. It was on the 4th floor of a building on 5th and Clement, and the office had that particular quality of expensive discretion: dark wood paneling, windows with frosted lower panes, a long mahogany table that could seat 12, though there were only 5 of us. Me, Kyle, Kyle's girlfriend Serena, a second cousin named Doug, who my father had apparently remembered in a small bequest, and an attorney I'd never met named Thomas Hartley. Thomas Hartley, the man from the envelope on Meridian Boulevard. When I saw his name on the door and his face behind the table, something cold moved through me, like stepping into shadow. I sat down. I looked at Hartley. I looked at Kyle. Kyle was looking at the table. Thomas Hartley cleared his throat and opened his folder and began. The last will and testament of Gerald Raymond Calloway, executed on the 14th of April of last year. Last April. 14 months before his death. 14 months. Which meant he rewrote his will, secretly, with a different attorney, while I was holding his hand through medication adjustments, while I was managing his business, while I was giving every available piece of myself to his life. The reading took about 20 minutes. I heard most of it in the way that you hear things through a buzzing that settled over your entire skull. Doug got a collectible car my father had kept in storage. Fair enough, Doug had always admired it. Kyle's girlfriend Serena got a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. And Kyle? Kyle got everything else. Every asset, every account, every share of Calloway Auto Parts distribution, the house, the investment portfolio, the life insurance, the retirement accounts, the real property. And I got the watch. I looked at Thomas Hartley while he wrapped up. His face was professionally neutral, the practiced neutrality of a man paid to deliver news without editorializing. I looked at Kyle. His eyes were finally up, fixed on a spot somewhere above my head, those practiced tears gathering at the corners. I looked at Serena, who was looking at her hands. I picked up my purse. I stood up. I walked out. In the car, in the parking garage, I gave myself 45 minutes. I sat with my hands flat on my thighs, and I breathed, and I thought, and I let myself feel the full weight of it before I made the decision to put the feeling away somewhere safe and start working. Here is what I knew, sitting in that car. My father had not had his mental faculties fully intact for the last 18 months of his life. The Parkinson's had begun affecting his cognition. It does in the later stages in ways that are not always obvious but are documented in medical records. I had attended every major medical appointment. I had spoken to Dr. Simmons and his team numerous times. I had documentation. Here is what else I knew. A will executed 14 months before death, with a different attorney from the one who'd handled all previous estate matters during a period of documented cognitive decline with a significant and unexplained change in beneficiaries. That raised questions. Legal questions. The kind of questions that attorneys who specialize in will contests love to ask. Here's the third thing I knew. I had spent 19 years building Callaway Auto Parts distribution. I understood every contract, every relationship, every account. I knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking. I knew the business the way you know a language you've spoken since childhood. Not just the words, but the grammar, the idiom, the unspoken rules. Kyle knew none of that. And Kyle was now, theoretically, the owner of a $12 million company he didn't understand. I turned the key in the ignition. I took one slow breath. And I said to myself, out loud, in the quiet of that parking garage, okay, let's go. I did not go back to Callaway Auto Parts the following Monday. I did not answer Kyle's calls when they started coming in, first curious, then increasingly anxious over the following week. I did not reach out to the employees or the vendors or the clients. I let Kyle walk into that office as its new owner and discover what it felt like to be responsible for something you didn't build and couldn't run. What I did instead was call an attorney named Patricia Voss, who had been referred to me by a colleague as one of the top probate litigators in the state. I called her the Friday after the will reading from my kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and a legal pad full of notes in front of me. I had spent 3 days preparing for that call. I had organized everything I could remember: dates, observations, medical records I could request, documents I'd handled. When Patricia Voss picked up, I spoke for 17 minutes straight without interruption, and when I finished, there was a pause. "Ms. Callaway," Patricia said, "I want to meet with you in person. Can you come in Monday?" I went in Monday. Patricia Voss was a small, sharp-featured woman in her 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the energy of someone who has been underestimated her entire career and has turned that into a superpower. She had a corner office that was meticulously organized, not in a show-off way, but in the way of someone who genuinely thinks better when everything has a place. She listened to everything I had to say, asked precise questions, and took notes in a small leather notebook in handwriting so tiny I couldn't read it from across the desk. "The cognitive decline argument is your strongest ground," she said when I'd finished. "Parkinson's with documented cognitive involvement, a major estate change 14 months before death with a different attorney, no apparent explanation for the change. This is a viable contest. But I want to be honest with you, Ms. Callaway. Will contests are expensive and not guaranteed. We need solid medical testimony about his capacity at the time of signing." "I know every doctor he saw in those 4 years," I said. "I was at most of those appointments. I can get you records." "Do that." She made a note. "I also want to understand the business situation. You say you've been running the company operationally for years?" "Since I was 18, effectively. Since I was 24 in a formal, documented capacity as VP of Operations." "Your employment relationship with Callaway Auto Parts? Is there a contract?" There was. I'd drafted it myself years ago to formalize things for tax and liability purposes, and my father had signed it. Salary, benefits, role description, everything properly documented. "Here's something else," Patricia said, leaning forward slightly. "Walk me through the power of attorney." The power of attorney. My father had granted me financial power of attorney 4 years ago, when his Parkinson's had progressed to the point where managing his own financial affairs was becoming difficult. It gave me the authority to act on his behalf in financial matters. It was comprehensive and properly recorded. Patricia was quiet for a moment. During the period when he would have been meeting with Hartley to revise his will, did you observe any other financial transactions you weren't aware of? Anything unusual in the accounts you managed? I thought about it. I thought carefully. And then I remembered something I had noted and filed away as a minor irregularity, a transfer of $15,000 from my father's personal account to an account I didn't recognize, about 16 months before his death. I'd asked my father about it. He'd said it was a personal loan to an old friend. I'd accepted that. $15,000, 16 months before his death, and the will had been rewritten 14 months before his death. I told Patricia. She wrote it down in that tiny handwriting. I want bank records from the last 2 years of his life, she said. All accounts. I have access to most of them. Get everything you can legally obtain. We'll subpoena the rest. I want to tell you about the next 12 months, because they are the part of this story that people get wrong when they imagine revenge. Revenge in movies is satisfying and quick, and involves a dramatic confrontation in a rain-soaked parking lot. Revenge in real life is 10,000 hours of work. It's phone calls and document requests and depositions and expert witnesses and waiting. It's learning the specific legal definitions of testamentary capacity and undue influence and constructive fraud. It's sitting in Patricia Voss's conference room at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, reading through my father's medical records with a forensic neurologist named Dr. Anita Sharma, identifying specific documented evidence of cognitive impairment during the relevant period. And it's watching, from a careful distance, as the thing you built starts to come apart in the hands of someone who doesn't know how to hold it. Kyle had walked into Callaway Auto Parts the week after the will reading with Serena on his arm, and an air of ownership that I'm told, because I had friends there, people who'd worked for me for years, and who called me privately, whispering into their phones like they were reporting from inside enemy territory, made several of the senior staff visibly wince. He announced in a company-wide meeting that he was taking the reins, and that while he had big shoes to fill, he was excited about the new direction. He did not define the new direction. He moved into the corner office that had been nominally my father's and effectively mine. He started with the obvious and expensive mistakes immediately. He decided to renegotiate the Midwest supply contracts without consulting anyone who knew those relationships, and within 6 weeks, he'd managed to alienate 2 of our 3 largest suppliers in that region. I know this because Marcus Webb, who'd been my head of supply chain for 4 years, called me every Tuesday night and gave me updates in a voice that got increasingly pained as the weeks went on. Marcus was fiercely loyal. He'd taken a below-market salary to stay with us when a competitor had tried to poach him because he believed in what we were building. Watching Kyle dismantle it was costing him something, and I could hear it in his voice. "He's not listening to anyone, Callie," Marcus told me one Tuesday in month 3. Dave from procurement tried to explain the Hendricks account, that it's relationship-based, that Dale Hendricks doesn't do business on pure price, you have to maintain the relationship, and Kyle just looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. He's going to lose that account. "Let him," I said. There was a pause. "You've got a plan," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Marcus, I can't tell you anything right now. Just keep doing your job as well as you always have." "He's been talking about layoffs," Marcus said quietly. "Restructuring. He hired a consultant." This was interesting. I made a note. The consultant Kyle hired was a man named Bryce Whitfield from a firm called Meridian Consulting Group, a boutique firm that did operational consulting for small and mid-sized businesses, and that I subsequently discovered was co-owned by Serena's older brother. I noted this and moved it into the file I was building. While Kyle was slowly unraveling the company's most important vendor relationships and bringing in a consultant with an undisclosed conflict of interest, I was building my case with Patricia Voss. Here is what we had assembled by month 8. Dr. Anita Sharma's expert report, which identified 3 separate clinical notes from my father's neurological records documenting moderate executive function impairment and compromised decision-making capacity during the period between January and June of the year the will was revised. The will was signed in April of that year. Dr. Sharma's opinion, stated clearly and with clinical precision, was that my father lacked the testamentary capacity required under state law to execute a valid will at the time of signing. Testimony from Bernadette, my father's home health aide, who described several occasions during that same period when my father had become confused about financial matters, had once told her he didn't know where his money was, and had on one occasion asked her if the company still belonged to him, or if he'd already given it away. Bernadette had written this in her care log. Her care log was now in evidence. Bank records showing the $15,000 transfer to an account held by Thomas Hartley's firm, the same attorney who'd prepared the new will, 16 months before my father's death, 2 months before the will revision. When Patricia had subpoenaed Hartley's billing records, the records showed no legitimate legal services billed to my father in that amount during that period, which raised a very specific and legally significant question about what that $15,000 was actually for. A letter which Patricia's investigator found among Kyle's disclosed documents in discovery, from Kyle to my father dated 13 months before the will signing, 6 months before the cognitive impairment began appearing in medical records, in which Kyle discussed in vague but unmistakable terms making sure things are set up right for the future, and referenced a meeting he'd had with someone about getting the paperwork organized. The letter was handwritten on Kyle's personal stationery, which he'd apparently used at some point in his life when he wanted to seem more formal. He probably wished he'd emailed instead. You can delete emails. Handwritten letters go into discovery. And then there was the matter of my employment. When Kyle had assumed control of the company, I had technically been terminated, by default, since the new owner hadn't offered me a new employment agreement. But my original employment contract had a specific clause, which I'd included years ago because I'd read enough business law to know it was a good idea, stipulating that in the event of a change of ownership or control, my employment agreement entitled me to 18 months of salary continuation at my then current rate, plus equity consideration based on the company's valuation at the time of transfer. If I had been the primary driver of the company's growth during my tenure, it was an unusual clause. It had been there for years. My father had signed it without blinking, because in the context of our relationship, neither of us had imagined this scenario. Kyle's own attorney, not Hartley, Kyle had hired a different firm for the business transition, had apparently not caught the implications of that clause when they reviewed the employment contracts. Or maybe they'd caught it and assumed I wouldn't pursue it. They didn't know me. By month 10, Patricia Voss had filed the formal will contest on 3 grounds: lack of testamentary capacity, undue influence, and fraud. We'd notified Thomas Hartley, who I suspected was not sleeping very well. We'd notified Kyle, who called me 3 times in the first week after being served, leaving voicemails that started formal and ended increasingly desperate. I didn't return the calls. There was nothing to say. In month 11, Kyle's attorney reached out to Patricia to discuss settlement. I had expected this. Kyle had inherited a company that was now losing money. The Hendricks account had been lost, as Marcus predicted, along with 2 others, and Bryce Whitfield's consulting fee was bleeding cash from operational accounts. And he was staring down a will contest that his own attorney had probably told him was uncomfortably strong. The $15,000 payment to Hartley was particularly problematic. It hadn't been properly documented, it didn't correspond to any legitimate services, and it had the appearance, not proven, but absolutely the appearance, of either a kickback or a facilitated fraud. That kind of thing has a tendency to make everyone in the room very uncomfortable. The settlement offer was 50%. I told Patricia to decline. "They'll go to 60, Patricia said, in a tone that meant, Are you sure about this? 60, 70, 80? No, I said. I want the company. I want the house. I want everything that was mine. Callie, Patricia leaned forward. Courts are unpredictable. We have a strong case, but do we have a strong case or do we not? She held my gaze. We have a very strong case. Then let's go to trial. We did not, as it turned out, go to trial. We got very close. Depositions completed, expert witnesses scheduled, a court date set for the following March, and then 9 days before trial, Kyle's attorney called Patricia again. The second settlement offer was everything, not literally everything. Kyle was keeping his own personal assets, his car, his savings, whatever he'd accumulated personally. But every asset that had come from the estate was on the table. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance proceeds, which by now had been partially spent, but for which Kyle would sign a note. And the company. The company. Here is what had happened to Kyle in the 11 months since he'd taken over. He had managed to reduce a $12 million operation to something closer to 9.5 through lost contracts, poorly managed vendor relationships, and the ongoing expense of Bryce Whitfield's consulting firm, which had billed the company for nearly $400,000 over 9 months for recommendations that Marcus, my head of supply chain, privately told me were the kind of thing anyone with 6 months in the industry would already know. Kyle had also, it emerged during discovery, used company funds to pay for personal expenses, a car lease, home renovation at his and Serena's apartment, 2 vacations, totaling approximately $80,000. This was technically embezzlement from the estate, which was another layer of legal exposure that Kyle's attorney clearly wanted to make disappear. I signed the settlement agreement on a Wednesday morning in February, 11 months after I'd walked out of Thomas Hartley's office. Patricia and I were at her conference table. She pushed the signature page across to me, and I picked up the pen, and my hand was completely steady. I signed my name, Caroline Renee Calloway. And then I sat back and thought about my father for a moment. I thought about him the way I try to think about him when I can manage it. Not the last year, not the will, but earlier. The kitchen on Sunday mornings, the way he looked when we closed a big deal, the shoulder pats. That's my girl. I thought, you gave me the tools. You gave me 19 years of learning how to build something and fight for it and never let go. You just didn't plan on me using those tools on you. I walked back into Callaway Auto Parts distribution on the first Monday of March, carrying my laptop bag and a coffee from the place on the corner that I'd been going to for years, and Marcus Webb was standing in the front lobby waiting for me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with this expression, relief, and something fiercer than relief, and held out his hand. I shook it. All right, I said. Let's get back to work. I won't pretend the work was simple. $9.5 million from 12, a half dozen damaged relationships, staff who'd spent nearly a year in the uncertainty of Kyle's ownership. There was real repair to be done. But here's the thing about building something from the ground up. You develop an intimacy with it that can't be replicated or bought. I knew exactly what had been broken and exactly how to fix it. I made calls, personally, to every vendor relationship that had frayed under Kyle's watch. I drove to see Dale Hendricks at Hendricks Supply in Indianapolis, the client Marcus had warned about, the relationship Kyle had obliterated, and I sat across from Dale in his office and told him plainly that I was back, that I was sorry, and that I intended to make it right. Dale Hendricks is a man of about 60 who grew up in the same era as my father and has a similarly low threshold for nonsense and a similarly high regard for people who tell him the truth straight. He looked at me across his desk for a long moment. Then he said, I always liked working with you, Callie. I know, I said. Don't let that happen again. I won't, I said. And I meant it with every part of myself. The Hendricks account came back. So did the others. By the end of my first full year back, we were at 11 million and trending upward. By the end of the second year, we'd passed 12 again and were heading toward 14. I kept every good person who'd stayed through Kyle's tenure, Marcus and Lisa in accounting, and Pete, who ran the warehouse in a way that somehow made every employee feel valued, and about 30 others who'd held on because they believed the company was worth holding on for. I let go of what Bryce Whitfield's firm had implemented, gracefully but thoroughly, and replaced it with systems that actually made sense for how we operated. I moved back into the corner office. I hung one thing on the wall, a framed photograph of my father standing in front of the original warehouse on the day he signed the lease in 1989. He's 37 years old in the photo, squinting into the camera, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. He looks like a man about to start something. I look at it sometimes. I think about the complexity of loving someone who failed you. I think about the fact that my father built something extraordinary out of almost nothing, and that somewhere in his Parkinson's fogged brain in April of a year that mattered, something had broken down or been deliberately manipulated. I'll never know with complete certainty which, and maybe that's the thing I've learned to live with. The medical evidence suggested impairment. The $15,000 suggested something more deliberate. I think the truth, the messy human truth, is probably both. A cognitively compromised old man, a charming younger son, and someone who knew exactly which levers to pull. Kyle and I don't speak. He and Serena moved back to Denver after the settlement. I heard through the family grapevine that he was working in some capacity in real estate, or had been, or was considering it. I don't follow his trajectory closely. I genuinely don't. The anger that drove me for those 11 months has burned down to something cooler and more permanent. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of settled understanding that some people are who they are, and the only thing you can control is what you build and how hard you're willing to fight for it. Thomas Hartley faced a separate complaint with the state bar. The $15,000 payment, the undisclosed nature of his engagement, the circumstances of the will's execution. Patricia had reported it, as she was ethically required to do, and as she also, I think, genuinely wanted to. I don't know where that investigation ended up. I deliberately chose not to follow it. I have enough things to manage. The house on Clearwater Drive, my father's house, the house I grew up in, the house where he died. I sold it. I thought hard about keeping it. Thought hard. I walked through it one last time before the sale, room by room, touching the walls in places like a person making sure something is real. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I stood in his bedroom. I thought about all the mornings and all the appointments and all the Sunday breakfasts and the hand squeezes in the car. I said goodbye to it. Properly. The way you're supposed to. I bought myself a small house about 15 minutes away. Not large, not showy, but with a garden that the previous owners had put real care into, all native plants and old roses that come back every spring without asking. I have a kitchen table where I have my coffee in the mornings, and a back porch where I sit in the evenings sometimes when the weather is right. I have a life that has room in it, finally, for things other than work, and I'm slowly, carefully learning what to put in that space. I am 39 years old. I run a $14 million company that I built. I wear my father's Seiko on my wrist every day. Not because it's valuable, not even because I want to, but because I decided that it was mine and I was keeping it, and that the story of what it cost me was not going to be a story of loss. It was going to be a story of what I got back. People ask me sometimes, people who know the broad strokes of what happened, colleagues and acquaintances who've heard versions of it, whether I'm angry, whether it changed me, whether I still think about my father with love. The answer to all three is yes, and I've made my peace with the fact that those things can all be true at the same time, that you can love someone who failed you, that you can build something beautiful out of betrayal, that walking out of a room quietly, with your head up and your hands steady, is sometimes the most powerful thing you'll ever do. Because power isn't noise. Power isn't the dramatic confrontation, the shouted accusations, the tears across the mahogany table. Those would have felt good for about 30 seconds and accomplished nothing. Power is sitting in a parking garage for 45 minutes, letting yourself feel the full weight of what was done to you, and then turning the key in the ignition. Power is making the phone call on Friday morning. Power is 11 months of work, 10,000 hours of preparation, one steady hand on a signature page. Power is walking back through the door of something that was always yours and saying simply, "Let's get back to work." My father used to say that the thing about the auto parts business was that it was never glamorous, never exciting, never the kind of thing that got you invited to fancy dinners or featured in magazines. But everything runs on something, he'd say. Every car, every truck, every machine that moves from one place to another, it needs what we make. The world doesn't go without us. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. He was wrong about me. Or maybe, and this is the thought I come back to, late at night, on the back porch, with the old roses coming up in the dark, maybe he wasn't wrong about me at all. Maybe he knew, somewhere, in whatever part of him was still clearly himself, exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Maybe the watch wasn't an insult. Maybe it was a starting pistol. I'll never know. That's okay. I wind it every morning. I put it on my wrist. I drive to work. And Callaway Auto Parts Distribution, my company in my name now, legally and permanently and completely, opens for another day.